There's a moment in your life that arrives without warning. You're sitting in a room full of people, friends, family, co-workers, and suddenly you feel completely alone. Not lonely. Just alone. Like you're standing on the other side of a glass wall, watching everyone move through routines you once found normal, listening to conversations that used to matter, and realizing with a quiet, unsettling certainty that you don't belong there anymore. You haven't changed locations, you've changed dimensions. And the people you love, they're still on the other side. Carl Jung called this the process of individuation, the journey toward becoming who you really are. But what he didn't sugarcoat, what most spiritual teachers won't tell you, is that awakening costs you nearly everything familiar. Your relationships fracture, your social circles thin out. The life you built starts to feel like a costume that no longer fits. Jung knew this personally. In his Red Book, he documented his own descent into what he called confrontation with the unconscious, a period where he lost friends, professional respect, and nearly his mind. He wrote that the path to selfhood is walked alone, not because you want it that way, but because most people cannot follow where you're going. Today, we're going to explore why awakening isolates you, why the people you thought would stay end up leaving, and what Jung discovered about the 5 inevitable shifts that make you unrecognizable to those who once knew you best. This isn't about becoming superior. It's about becoming true. And truth, as Jung warned, has a price. Most people live fragmented. They wear one face at work, another at home, another online. They say yes when they mean no. They laugh at jokes that aren't funny. They perform emotions they don't feel. Not because they're fake, but because they've learned that survival requires 1,000 tiny betrayals of self. Jung called this the persona, the mask we wear to fit in, to be accepted, to avoid conflict. And for most of your life, you wore it too. You adjusted your tone depending on who was in the room. You softened your opinions. You dimmed your intensity so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable. But then something shifted. Maybe it was a crisis, a loss, a moment of unbearable truth that cracked you open. Whatever it was, you started to see the mask for what it was, a costume. And slowly, without even deciding to, you began to take it off. Not because you wanted to rebel, but because you couldn't keep wearing it. This is what Jung called integration, the process of bringing all your fragmented selves into one unified field. You stopped performing. You stopped code switching. You stopped pretending you were someone you weren't. And in that moment, you became whole. But here's the problem. Most people can only connect with you through fragmentation. They don't know how to be around someone who isn't performing. They mistake your stillness for arrogance, your honesty for judgment, your lack of reaction for coldness, because in their world, love is expressed through mirroring, through matching energy, through playing the game, through pretending together. And you stopped pretending. Jung wrote that the individuated person becomes a mirror that reflects reality as it is, not as people wish it to be. And most people, when they see themselves clearly for the first time, don't like what they see. So they blame the mirror. They start saying things like, "You've changed, you're not fun anymore. You think you're better than us?" But that's not what happened. You didn't become better. You became coherent. And coherence feels threatening to people who are still fractured. This is the first loss. The relationships built on performance fall away because you're no longer willing to perform. Before awakening, you were reactive. Someone said something hurtful, you snapped back. Someone shared exciting news, you matched their energy. Someone vented about their problems. You absorbed their emotions like a sponge. You were a mirror, a chameleon, a live wire constantly responding to the emotional weather around you. It felt normal. It felt like connection. But after awakening, something changes. Your nervous system starts to regulate itself. The mental chatter decreases. Your breathing slows. You stop being pulled into every emotional current that passes through the room. Jung called this state presence without identification, the ability to be fully aware of what's happening without becoming it. You can witness someone's anger without catching it. You can hear someone's anxiety without absorbing it. You can sit in silence without needing to fill it. This is a rare quality. It's what mystics call equanimity, what psychologists call emotional regulation, what Jung called the capacity to hold tension without collapsing into reaction. But to people who are still fragmented, your calm looks like indifference. They vent to you, expecting you to panic with them. You listen, but you don't panic. They share drama, expecting you to take sides. You acknowledge it, but you don't engage. They test you with criticism, expecting you to defend yourself. You nod, but you don't react, and they interpret your stillness as coldness, because in their world love is reactive. Love is matching their energy. Love is getting upset when they're upset, celebrating when they celebrate, fighting when they fight. If you're not reacting, they assume you don't care. But that's not what's happening. You care deeply. You just don't collapse into their emotional field anymore. You hold space for them without losing yourself. And that feels unfamiliar, uncomfortable, even threatening. Jung observed this in his own life. After his break from Freud and his years of inner work, his former colleagues found him distant, cold, detached, not because he stopped caring, but because he stopped performing care in the ways they recognized. He wrote, "The more one becomes oneself, the lonelier one becomes. Not because one withdraws, but because one no longer participates in the collective unconscious, the shared illusions that bind people together. This is the second loss. The relationships built on emotional enmeshment dissolve, because you're no longer willing to lose yourself to maintain connection." Most people hide their darkness. They bury their anger, shame, envy, and fear beneath layers of politeness, positivity, and performance. They curate their image. They highlight their strengths and conceal their flaws. They present a version of themselves that's acceptable, likable, safe, and for most of your life you did the same. But awakening changes this. You begin what Jung called shadow work, the process of turning toward the parts of yourself you've been taught to reject. The anger you were told was bad, the sadness you were told to get over, the selfishness you were told made you unlovable. You stop running from these parts. You acknowledge them. You integrate them. And in doing so you become transparent, not reckless, not oversharing, but honest. You stop pretending you're always okay. You stop laughing at things that aren't funny. You stop agreeing with opinions you don't hold. You stop performing perfection. And this transparency makes people uncomfortable, because when you stop hiding your shadow, it becomes a mirror for theirs. Your honesty reminds them of the lies they're still telling themselves. Your authenticity highlights the masks they're still wearing. Your refusal to pretend exposes the performance they're still caught in. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." But most people aren't ready to make the darkness conscious. They're still building their identity around being good, being positive, being strong. And when you show up as someone who's integrated both light and dark, they feel betrayed. They say things like, "You're so negative now. You're always talking about heavy stuff. Can't you just be positive for once?" But you're not negative. You're real. And reality includes darkness. This is what Jung called shadow transparency, the ability to acknowledge all of yourself without shame, without needing to hide, without needing approval. It's one of the rarest qualities of an awakened person, but it costs you the relationships built on mutual pretending, The friendships where everyone agreed to only show their highlight reel. The connections where darkness was never allowed at the table. Those relationships fall away, not because you pushed them away, but because you stopped upholding the illusion that held them together. This is the third loss. The relationships built on image management crumble because you're no longer willing to hide who you are. There was a time when you could engage in small talk effortlessly. You could chat about the weather, weekend plans, the latest TV show, office gossip. You could laugh at surface-level jokes, nod along to shallow opinions, and pass the time with meaningless exchanges that maintained social harmony. It wasn't painful. It was just normal. But after awakening, small talk becomes unbearable. Not because you're arrogant, not because you think you're above it, but because you've touched something deeper, something real, and going back to the surface feels like suffocating. Jung experienced this acutely. After his years of exploring the unconscious, he found it nearly impossible to engage in casual conversation. He wrote that once you've seen the depths of the psyche, once you've encountered the archetypes and the shadow and the self, ordinary social interaction feels like playing a game you no longer believe in. You sit at a dinner table and someone talks about their new car. You nod, but inside you're thinking about mortality, meaning, purpose. Someone complains about a minor inconvenience. You listen, but you're aware of the existential weight beneath their words, the fear, the loneliness, the search for significance. You don't judge them for it. You just can't pretend it's enough anymore. This is what Jung called the loneliness of depth, the recognition that most conversations stay on the surface because going deeper is terrifying. People bond over shared distractions, shared complaints, shared illusions. And when you're no longer interested in those distractions, you lose access to those bonds. You start declining invitations, not because you're antisocial, but because sitting through another conversation about nothing feels like dying slowly. You stop texting in group chats, not because you're rude, but because the banter feels hollow and people notice. They start saying, "Oh, you never come around anymore. You're too serious, like you're no fun." But it's not that you're too serious. It's that you've become attuned to truth. And truth doesn't fit into small talk. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But most people don't want transformation. They want comfort. They want familiarity. They want to stay the same. And so the relationships built on surface-level connection fall away, because you're no longer able to stay on the surface. This is the fourth loss. The social bonds held together by distraction dissolve, because you're no longer willing to pretend shallow is enough. Every person is born into a tribe, a family system, a cultural narrative, a set of unspoken rules about who you should be, what you should value, how you should live. And for most of your life, you obeyed those rules. You became the role they gave you, the responsible one, the funny one, the quiet one, the achiever. Your identity was shaped by their expectations. Your worth was measured by their approval. Your sense of belonging depended on playing the part they cast you in, but awakening disrupts this. You start questioning the rules. You start seeing through the narratives. You start realizing that the identity you've been living isn't yours, it's theirs. Jung called this differentiation from the collective, the process of separating your true self from the roles, beliefs and expectations imposed by your tribe. It's the psychological equivalent of leaving home, not physically but spiritually. And it terrifies the people who need you to stay in the role. Your family gets uncomfortable when you stop playing the peacemaker. Your friends get defensive when you stop laughing at jokes that demean others. Your community gets threatened when you stop conforming to their political, religious or cultural identity, because your awakening exposes the cage they're still living in. Your freedom threatens their sense of safety. Your refusal to stay small makes them question why they're still shrinking. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But that privilege comes with exile. Not always dramatic, not always hostile, but real. Your old tribe stops inviting you, stops calling, stops including you. Not because they hate you, but because you remind them of the version of themselves they're too afraid to become. And you feel it, the ache of outgrowing the people who raised you, loved you, knew you. The grief of realizing that the life you built no longer fits. The loneliness of standing outside the circle, watching them continue the rituals you can no longer participate in. This is the fifth loss. The tribal identity that once defined you falls away, because you're no longer willing to betray yourself to belong. Jung didn't sugarcoat the loneliness of awakening. He wrote about it in his letters, his journals, his lectures. He admitted that individuation is a solitary path, that becoming yourself means losing most of the relationships that were built on the version of you that wasn't real. But he also discovered something on the other side. He found that the people you lose weren't really there in the first place. They were connected to your mask, not your face. They loved your performance, not your presence. They needed you to stay small, fragmented, reactive, surface level, and when you became whole, those connections dissolved. Not because you failed them, but because they were never meant to last. But here's what Jung also discovered. New connections emerged, not many, but real. The kind of people who don't need you to perform, who can sit with you in silence without discomfort, who aren't threatened by your depth, your honesty, your calm, who see you, really see you, and don't ask you to be anything other than what you are. Jung called these soul connections, relationships rooted not in shared illusions but in shared truth. They're rare. They're slow to form. But they're unshakable, because they're not built on who you're pretending to be. They're built on who you actually are, and that, Jung said, is worth the loss of 1,000 surface-level bonds. He wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. After awakening, you lose the people you couldn't communicate truth with. But you gain the ability to connect with those who can, and that changes everything." Jung believed we were entering a collective awakening. He saw it coming in his time. The breakdown of old systems, the collapse of shared illusions, the rise of individual consciousness. He warned that this transition would be chaotic, painful, isolating, because awakening isn't gentle. It's disruptive. It breaks apart everything that isn't real, and for a while it feels like loss, like exile, like you're the only one who sees what's happening. But Jung also believed this loneliness was temporary. He called it the dark night before the dawn of the self, the period where the old identity dies and the true self is still emerging. He wrote, "The world will ask you who you are, and if you do not know, the world will tell you. Awakening is the process of knowing, of refusing to let the world define you, of becoming so rooted in your own truth that you no longer need external validation to feel real. And yes, it costs you. It costs you the people who couldn't meet you there. It costs you the comfort of belonging to a tribe that requires you to be small. It costs you the illusion that you can be yourself and never be alone. But it gives you something far greater, the capacity to live as yourself, fully, without apology, without performance, without fear." Jung's final insight was this: the people you lose after awakening were never yours to keep. They belong to the version of you that was never real. And the people who stay, they're not staying for who you were. They're staying for who you've become. That's the gift. That's the prize. That's what makes the loneliness worth it. Because on the other side of awakening, you're not just free from the people who couldn't love the real you. You're free to be loved for who you actually are. And that, Jung said, is the only love worth having.